Oh, hi. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this sweet universal table saw fence jiggy thing. This is really cool. It allows you to do a ton of different stuff. I originally wanted to make it because I wanted to do some raised panels. It'll do that. It'll do bridle joints, angled, regular bridle joints. It'll do mortise and tenon. It'll do castle joints. It'll do a ton of different stuff. So follow along, watch me make this so you can make your own. There's plans available for pre-order on our website. There's a link down below. And if you don't want to make it and you don't want to buy the plans, we're actually working on having these just available for sale. So if you want to sign up to be notified when you can just purchase this whole setup right here, well, there's a link down in the description for that as well.
Well, hello folks, buckle up, get ready, and let's build ourselves a table saw jig fence thing. Now this particular jig is going to work by sliding across the existing table saw fence. So the first thing I had to do was get a bunch of measurements off of my fence, which is a saw stop, don't tell anybody. And once I had those measurements, I started ripping down some 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. Now I'm basically going to create a box that encompasses the table saw fence and can slide across it using the table saw fence as guidance, but I don't want the fence to cause friction on my box. So as you can see here, I'm making it so that the box is just a hair higher than the actual fence so that it doesn't drag across the fence and, well, not slide smooth. You want it to be like butter, like your grandma all greased up going down a slip and slide. Smooth and slightly disturbing. Now I have in my head how I want this jig to work, and it will make a lot more sense as we get farther along in the video. But basically I'm creating a box on two sides, the top and the other side, and then a taller kind of fence thingamajig on the side that's closest to the blade. This is going to allow me to eventually mount a plate to my sliding component and make the jig a little more universal. So this is the basic components of the sliding portion of the jig. I got a little piece of wood on the side, a piece of wood on the top, and then a taller piece of wood on the side facing the blade. Now I just got to hook all these pieces together. But like any jig I make, it can't just be a bunch of stuff slapped together. It's got to be all nice and fancy, which means I want to round it over and sand it and make it look good. So I marked all the edges that don't need roundovers, and then I rounded over all the other edges with an 1/8 inch roundover bit. After breaking down all the edges, it was time to sand everything smooth. I just went straight to 150 grit sandpaper so that it was soft to the touch. Then using my littler piece, that's the exact height I want the jig to sit, I marked on my taller piece where I needed to hook in my cross piece. I know that was a lot of pieces I just mentioned, but hopefully you'll get the general idea. Now, to make it easier on myself, I hooked everything together with CA glue and a little activator spray to start out with. This will lock everything in the correct position, and then I can come back and add screws once I know it's working properly. So, after hooking all 3 of my pieces together with the CA glue, I went back over to the table saw and I just checked to make sure that it would slide over my fence the way I wanted it to. Now you'll notice there's a little bit of wobble here because I made it kind of loose. Now I did this on purpose and you'll understand why later in the video. But I'm not going to tell you right now. I'm going to leave you on the hook because, well, I want you to watch my video longer because that's how I make my money. Just being honest here. Happy with the overall fit of my jig on the table saw fence, I went back over to my work table and using a countersink bit, I drilled a few pilot holes for my screws. I think I'm using 1.5 inch stainless steel screws here. You don't have to use stainless steel, that's just what I had laying around. Now you might be asking, were the screws really necessary? Wouldn't the glue be strong enough to hold these pieces of wood together? Maybe, but when it comes to running stuff through the table saw, I definitely don't want the jig falling apart as I do that. So if it were me, which it is in this case, I'd add some screws. You don't want this thing to be compromised. I quickly realized that it would be very nice to have a handle to hold on to as you push this whole jig through the saw. and I just happened to have this little handle laying around. So I did a little countersink hole on the bottom for the bolt to recess into, drilled a through hole all the way through. I guess that's why it's called a through hole. And then I screwed on my handle. Then it was back over to the table saw, and as you can see, ooh, slick. This thing is sliding just the way I wanted it to. Now I got to build the face, which is actually going to be the jig component of this entire build. Originally, I was just going to build this out of Baltic birch ply as well, but then I was at my local hardwood supplier, the Hardwood Center, located on Highway 34 between Corvallis and Albany, Oregon, and I noticed they had this black melamine, and I thought, this would look pretty sweet if I built the whole face component out of that. So I bought a sheet and I started ripping it down to the correct size. Unfortunately, I only need a 20-inch by 20-inch square, and I had to buy a full 4x8 sheet, but that's okay. I'm sure I'll find something else to use this stuff for. It's basically going to look like this, a nice big surface that will allow me to do all sorts of different things on the table saw. Once I had the shape cut, I went over to my work table and I broke the edge with that same 1/8-inch roundover bit. This is more to prevent the melamine from chipping out than anything else. Then it was time to figure out how to mount that sheet of melamine to my existing plywood slider jig part. Now, the thought occurred to me that I might not always want a giant 20-inch by 20-inch piece of melamine slapped on the edge of this slider. If I made it removable, then I could use other components and still use the same slider part for that jig, if that makes any sense at all. So I wanted to make it easy to remove the melamine from the slider portion of the jig. So after marking out on the slider section, I drilled through the slider and through my melamine to make sure that those holes were perfectly lined up. Once I had a nice little pilot hole drilled, I recessed some little holes on the front of the melamine with a Forstner bit. This is going to allow me to recess the bolts that will hold the entire thing to the slider section. After I did the little zip zap zoop with the drill, it looked something like this. You only need to go in like, I don't know, 3/16, maybe 1/8 of an inch. I broke that edge with a piece of sandpaper because once again, I didn't want the melamine to chip out. And then using a backer board, I drilled all the way through the center of those holes with, I believe, an 11/32 bit. Maybe it was 9/32. Anyways, it was a big enough bit to get these little bolts through. Just like this. Ooh. Ah. Yeah, baby. Then I drilled that same size hole through the Baltic birch slider component. I don't know why I left such a long clip of this in there, but there you have it. Me drilling 3 holes. Fascinating. Then I just added these little easy to remove knobs. I'm sure these all have names, but I don't know what they are. And I put my handle back on. Now my melamine is securely attached to the slider. Now to fix this pesky wobble. I knew from the beginning I wanted to make the tolerance across the fence adjustable. I just wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that until I found this sweet toilet seat hardware. These nylon bolts should work perfect to micro adjust the tolerance on the fence and also make it universal to other table saws. The toilet seat hinge hardware comes with these sweet flanges. They just have these little plastic ribs that were going to be in the way, so I used a pole saw and quickly removed those. And then I had the flange that looked something like this, and all I had to do was glue that inside of my existing jig. The only problem is the side of my jig was 1/2-inch plywood. If I would have used 3/4 inch, I wouldn't have had this problem. And the flange, well, it was just a little too long, so it stuck out the 1/2-inch ply, like this. But not to worry, I've got a tool that'll fix that in a jiffy. I just drilled the right size hole in a scrap piece of 1/2-inch ply, inserted one of my flanges, taped it in place with a piece of painter's tape, flipped it upside down, and ran it through the drum sander one time. This allowed me to sand the flange down so it was perfectly flush with the 1/2-inch ply. I just repeated this for 3 flanges, and now we were ready to glue them in place. So back over to the table saw where I removed my melamine fence, pulled off my slider portion of the jig, marked out where I wanted my holes drilled for the flanges, used a little backer board against my table saw because I didn't want to drill a hole in my table saw, and drilled out 3 holes for my 3 flanges. Is it even called a flange? Is that the correct word? I don't know. The little plastic thing with the threads in it. Anyways, once my holes were all drilled out, I tested the fit of my flanges. That's just gonna be it. That's what I'm going with. And then I squirted out some Total Boat Thick So. Total Boat, baby. Smeared a little bit on the edges of the flange sleeve, as you would have it. And then I very carefully just inserted them into place. Now all I have to do is wait for this glue to dry and test to see if my contraption will work. While I was waiting for the Thick So to dry, I decided these bolts didn't need to be this long, so I cut them down to 1 inch, which should be plenty of adjustability. Then I inserted them into a spare flange that I had, and I cut them to length again with the Japanese pole saw, because this is fine woodworking at its best. Then I screwed the thing all the way through the flange. It's got a nice flat edge, but I want it to be a little more rounded and smooth so it slides across the fence better. Went over to my oscillating belt sander, rounded over the end, and then I buffed it over on the buffing wheel so that it was nice and shiny and smooth and should slide across that fence just like Grandma on that slip and slide. Jason, quit mentioning grandmas on slip and slides, you weirdo. The next day, the glue was dry. I sanded any excess smear that got on the outside of the jig off real quick. Then I inserted my bolts. As you can see, it's real wobbly, but all you gotta do is screw these bolts in until they're just making contact with the fence, not too tight because you still want it to slide, and the wobble is gone. We now have a nice adjustable fit across the fence. Problem solved.
I want to give a huge thanks to AG1 for sponsoring this video. Now, if you've been on the internet at all, well, you've probably seen an ad or 2 for AG1 because they're all over the place. And you might be thinking, what is the deal with this stuff? Why am I seeing it everywhere? Well, you're seeing it everywhere because it works and it's awesome. As somebody who enjoys AG1 on a daily basis, let me tell you, it's great. Now, AG1 is a foundational nutritional supplement that kind of covers all of your nutritional bases. It's great and it's super easy to add into your daily routine. All you need is 8 to 12 ounces of water. You put it in a little shaker like this, and you add in the AG1 powder, just like this. And you screw on the lid, and you shake. Now, the thing I love about AG1 is you might take a bunch of different supplements because you're expecting them to do different things, and so you end up taking a crazy amount of supplements. The nice thing about AG1 is everything is in there. Gut health, immune defense, focus and energy. It's all in this nice little bottle there. It's delicious. AG1 only uses the highest quality ingredients, which is great because you can trust what you're putting in your body. So if you want to try AG1, which you should, go to drinkag1.com/bourbonmoth, or you can scan the QR code and you get a year's supply of their vitamin D3 plus K2, and you're going to get 5 free AG1 travel packets. So, like I said, QR code, link down below. Huge thanks to AG1 for sponsoring this video. Now, back to work.
Now it's time to take this blank sheet of melamine and make it something that's actually useful, which means I need to add some hold down clamps, which means I need to add a way for those hold down clamps to stay on there, which means T-Track is probably my best option. I bought these little plus sign T-Track kits on the internet. I'll put a link in the video description. And then I just bought some straight pieces of T-Track. I'm going to recess this into the melamine. So I put a dado stack in my dado saw, messed around with it till I had just the right fit to fit the T-Track in there. And then I started crossing my fingers and hoping I didn't really screw up this sheet of melamine, because I don't want to have to go back and redo the whole thing at this point. Now, melamine is prone to chipping, so to help prevent that, I figured out exactly where I was going to cut my dado, and I just put a nice sticky piece of painter's tape right across that line. This should help prevent the chip out. You also want to go really nice and slow with your cut. If you just run it through there at full speed, well, you're probably going to get a few more chips. So in combination with the tape and the slow speed, I got a very clean cut on the melamine, which made me very happy. With a pretty good system in place for cutting out those dados, I just kept cutting out dados. I added a little tape, I ran them through the saw, and I went to town. I'm going to have 4 dados in total to kind of create this grid of T-track, which should give me plenty of options when it comes to holding various parts and pieces to this fence. Pretty soon I had all of my dados cut. I just hit all the edges with the sandpaper, again, just to negate the possibility of the melamine chipping, and then I started fitting all of my little T-track pieces in place. Now, the little plus signs weren't long enough for every instance, so I did have to cut some myself, which means I had to add a nice 45-degree angle, kind of at a point on the ends of some of my pieces. So I just used the stock plus sign pieces as a template. I scored it with a box knife like so, and then I just went over to my miter saw and cut it with a normal wood miter saw blade. I don't know if this is really bad for your blade, but it's aluminum. Can't be that terrible, right? Just make sure you wear safety glasses. The last thing you want is a chip of sharp aluminum in your eyeball. Ouch. Then with my angle cut on the end of the piece, I would go over, I would stick it in my little fence, and then using the box knife again, I would score right along the edge and then go back over to the miter saw and cut it to length. I just kind of kept working my way across the entire board until I had all my pieces of T-track cut to the correct size to fill in all my little gaps and grooves. But because this is a video and you need to watch me do unnecessary things, I'm going to show you way more footage of this process than you probably need to see. But there you have it. Pretty soon, all my T-track was cut, and this thing was really starting to look like something. Once I was happy with all the fits of the various pieces, I squirted out some more Total Boat Fixo, and using a paintbrush, I very delicately added a thin layer of thickened epoxy in every single one of those channels. Then I went through and replaced all of my pre-cut pieces. Now the Fixo would probably be plenty of enough hold down for these T-tracks, but because I'm a little crazy, I decided to also insert some screws because there's a bunch of holes in the T-track and they were just asking for it. Now that I have this done and you can fit all these hold down clamps, I had one more idea to make this jig a little more universal. If I took this center bolt at the bottom and made it a pivot point for a fence that could angle, it would allow me to do angled bridle joints, which meant that I had to create some sort of curved slot at the top to allow that piece to change angles. So I grabbed my Rockler circle cutting jig and I just hooked it to my pivot point down at the bottom there to see if this would work. And sure enough, as long as I'm very careful not to go into my T-track, it should allow me to cut a nice curved channel at the top of this fence. So I went over to my work table, inserted some ISO tunes in my ear holes because routers are really loud when you're cutting melamine, and ISO tunes are awesome. And very carefully, I started cutting out a channel across the top of that fence. This was pretty nerve-wracking because at this point I had done a lot of work on this tiny square of melamine, and if I screw it up now, well, I'm going to have to go all the way back to the beginning, which means cutting it to size and breaking those edges with a round over bit, and then adding my recessed holes for the bolts at the bottom, and then cutting all the dados and reinserting new T-track, and then trying to cut the channel. Thankfully, as far as I could tell, I hadn't screwed anything up yet. But don't worry, there's still time. I'm still clenching my buttocks very hard at this point. Now on the back, I had to make the channel a little wider and recess a little drop down step so that the back of the bolt could sit flush against the back of the fence. I don't know if that's completely necessary, it just seemed a little fancier and more professional. Pretty soon the channel was cut all the way through the fence with that recess on the back, and I think this is going to work the way that I have it pictured in my mind. So I took the entire thing back over to the table saw. There's my nice little channel. I hooked it on to my plywood slider component, with my bolts right through the front, but the middle bolt this time I stuck out the front, which will allow us to mount our adjustable fence, which I created out of just a scrap piece of poplar. I drilled a hole at the top for a corresponding bolt that slides across that curved channel, and then I kind of tightened everything down with more adjustable knobs, like so. Now the way this works to cut angled bridle joints is you cut your angle on 2 pieces of wood that you want to attach. You mark out where you need to remove material for your mortise and tenon. Then you take one of your angled pieces over to the handy dandy jig. You hold it tight against that adjustable fence and you rotate it until the angle is flush against the top of your table saw. Then you lock down the fence in that position. Use some of these hold down clamps to hold it nice and secure. And then you adjust your table saw blade to the exact height of the pieces that you're cutting your bridle joint on, so it creates a through tenon. And then you just line it up on your markings to cut out all the material you need to remove. Zip zap zoop. It's so easy, it makes you want to jump for joy. You thought I was going to say poop. It really is pretty darn easy. And if you had multiple pieces, obviously you would do each piece in each step to get them exactly right. Once you cut out the slot for your mortise, then you put in the piece that you're going to cut out for your tenon. And because you don't want to cut into the actual jig, halfway through your cut for your tenon, you can just adjust the adjustable angled fence on the other side so you can cut on the outside and not cut too close to your jig, marring your jig and, well, setting off your saw stop if you hit that aluminum. Just like that. I mean, this took me less than 2 minutes to cut both of these. I have a nice, perfectly fitting bridle joint. I glued it together and I sanded it, and it looked something like this. I mean, that's pretty darn fun to make that joint. I'm gonna have to incorporate that into some more furniture. Speaking of which, the reason I actually started building this jig to begin with is because I wanted a way to do raised panels for cabinets. Because I have an upcoming piece that I'm going to be working on in the next couple weeks, and I think raised panels would look pretty sweet. But in order to do that safely, well, you need to mount a piece of wood vertically and run it through the table saw. Because I don't have giant router bits to add the curve over on the router table. But it couldn't be easier with this jig. You literally just use the 4 hold downs, rotate the piece of wood around 4 times, set whatever angle you feel like on the table saw, and with a little zip zap zoop, you still have time to eat a bowl of soup. I mean, look, it's perfect. And it took me about 45 seconds to cut one panel. Pretty sweet.
I gotta say, I am so stoked with how this came out. It works absolutely perfect, exactly how I had it in my head. I mean, look at this. I've never cut a bridle joint before in my life, believe it or not. This is the first one, and it looks pretty darn good. Almost like I knew what I was doing. So, if you want to make this, sign up for pre-sale. They're available for plans. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what I'm getting at down in the video description. If you don't want to make it, sign up to be notified when these are going to be available for purchase over on our website. There's a link down there too. And if you don't want to buy plans or buy it, just watch the video close enough that you can rip me off. Because, you know, that's also an option. It's not the one I would choose, but, you know, you do you. Until next time. How do I salute? Sometimes I do weird things. I don't even think about it. I just act. Gosh.